In Texas, more than 120 people are now confirmed to have died in last week's flash floods, and dozens are still missing, including several campers who were sleeping in cabins alongside the Guadalupe River when it burst its banks in the early hours of July the 4th. Camp Mystic first opened back in 1926, but 6 years ago it expanded, building several new cabins, including in designated flood zones close to the river's edge, according to a report in the New York Times. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Robert Mace. Now, he's the Executive Director at the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment at Texas State University. Welcome to you. Now, the New York Times is reporting that cabins at Camp Mystic, so this youth camp where dozens of young people died, that it sat in a flood zone, some of them even in an area that the county deemed extremely hazardous. Could you begin by telling us your reaction to this?
Well, kind of my first reaction was a surprise that there were flood maps for Kerr County and for that area. Much of Texas does not have flood zone mapping. Secondly, it is surprising that there's new construction in a flood zone, even though construction in a flood zone is allowed as long as that construction meets certain requirements. But, you know, being a water person, someone who's been involved in floods and flood planning in Texas, you know, it's just not a good idea to be building down in the floodplain of a river, particularly in the hill country.
I just want to sort of ask you a bit more about that. Just explain to us why developments in flood zones like this camp and other types of housing is allowed to happen at all.
It's a great question. You know, Texas, and this is also a national issue, you know, is the United States is very respectful of private property. And so people that own water along a river with live water, in other words, water that's flowing, they want to be as close to that water as possible. And we'll build in those places. And if certain requirements are made, such as, you know, building up to a certain height, then you can get permission from a county or from a city to build in a floodplain.
Okay. Now, I just want to ask you about a quote. You've been quoted in the Texas Tribune as saying, "My advice is a river is beautiful, but as we've all seen, it can be a raging, horrific beast and it needs to be treated with respect." When you say respect, what specifically do you mean here?
For me personally, it's not building in the flood zone. And these flood maps are conservative in the sense that they're representing the past climate, and even worse, a climate that was maybe 15 or more years ago. And with warming, we're seeing more intense storms, and these floods are going to become more frequent and more fierce. And so for me, it's treating the river with respect is always recognizing that what happened at Camp Mystic and in many other places in the hill country in the past is always on the table as a possibility. And, you know, and if you do choose to live in the flood zone, make sure that you're connected to knowing when floods might be imminent and getting out as soon as possible.
I guess you're talking about the future now, and if we take a constructive look at the future, what should happen to prevent disasters like this from occurring?
Well, when bad things happen, that's a time to assess, you know, self-assess at all different levels. You know, try to understand what happened to cause the response or the lack of response that we saw, and then identify what it is that we can do better, and then do better.
That was Dr. Robert Mace, Executive Director at the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment in Texas. Thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you.